She was sold in chains while still bleeding from birth, but a lone Apache bought her for her freedom. What happened next would change not just her life, but challenge everything the frontier believed about mercy, justice, and what it truly means to be human. Arizona Territory, September 1881. The sun carved shadows like knife wounds across the dusty plaza of Copper Creek, a town that existed solely because silver ran through its veins and human misery filled its coffers. Wooden platforms had been erected in the center square, crude stages where lives were measured in dollars and dignity was auctioned to the highest bidder. On the largest platform, 17-year-old Esperanza Valdez knelt in iron shackles, her wrists raw and bleeding from the metal that bound her. Her long black hair hung in matted strands around her face, unable to hide the exhaustion etched into every line of her young features. The simple cotton dress she wore was stained with blood from her recent childbirth, the fabric clinging to her trembling frame. In her arms, wrapped in a torn piece of burlap, lay her newborn daughter. The infant was barely 3 days old, born in the back of a wagon during the brutal journey from the Valdez ranch after raiders had swept through, killing her parents and kidnapping her for this very moment. The baby's cries were weak, hungry, a sound that cut through the crowds, jeering like a blade. Marcus Wheeler, the auctioneer, stood tall in his black coat and silver vest, his voice booming across the plaza with the practiced enthusiasm of a man who had learned to profit from human suffering. "Ladies and gentlemen, behold a rare opportunity," he called out, gesturing toward Esperanza with a theatrical flourish. "Young, strong, comes with additional value in the form of breeding stock already produced, fresh from the Valdez spread, untainted by town life, ready for whatever work you see fit." The crowd pressed closer, a mix of ranchers, miners, and drifters who had come to Copper Creek not for silver, but for the monthly human auctions that drew buyers from across the territory. Their faces were hard, calculating, viewing Esperanza not as a person, but as an investment. Some laughed at crude jokes shouted from the back. Others examined her like livestock, discussing her potential worth in voices loud enough for her to hear. "She's still bleeding," called out a man in a worn cowboy hat, tobacco juice staining his beard. "Hardly broken in proper yet." Wheeler grinned, revealing teeth stained yellow from years of whiskey and cigars. "That's what makes her valuable, friend. Young enough to train, old enough to work, and proven fertile. The child proves she can produce more laborers for your operation." Esperanza kept her eyes fixed on the wooden planks beneath her knees, each jeering comment driving deeper into her soul. She had been raised on her family's small ranch outside Santa Fe, taught to read and write by her mother, schooled in both Spanish and English by the traveling priest who visited monthly. 3 days ago, she had been a daughter, a woman on the verge of motherhood surrounded by love. Now, she was merchandise. The iron chain around her ankle was bolted to a heavy post, the metal having already rubbed her skin raw during the long nights she had spent on this platform. Every movement sent spikes of pain through her body, still recovering from childbirth without proper care or rest. But she held her daughter close, whispering prayers in Spanish that the child might somehow survive whatever was to come. "Starting bid is $100, Wheeler announced, his voice cutting through the desert air. 100 for the pair, mother and child, healthy stock from good Mexican breeding." Hands shot up across the crowd as men shouted their bids. 120, called a cattle rancher from the north. 150, counted a mine owner whose operation was notorious for working people to death. The price climbed steadily as Esperanza listened to her life being negotiated like a horse or a piece of equipment. Each bid felt like another chain being wrapped around her spirit. She had heard stories of what happened to women sold at these auctions. Some disappeared into remote ranches where they were worked until they collapsed. Others were sent to mining camps where they faced horrors she could barely imagine. A few might find themselves in households where they were treated marginally better, but still owned, still property. $200, shouted a man near the front, his expensive clothes marking him as one of the territory's more successful entrepreneurs. This was Jonathan Krebs, owner of 3 copper mines, and known for his particular cruelty toward the Mexican and Apache workers he employed. His operations had the highest mortality rate in the territory, and his personal household staff rarely lasted more than a few months before fleeing or simply disappearing. The baby in Esperanza's arms began to cry again, the sound weak and desperate. She had no milk to offer, having eaten almost nothing in 3 days. The child needed proper care, medicine, warmth. Instead, she would likely be separated from her mother within hours of the sale, sent to work as soon as she was old, enough to hold a tool. $250, came another voice. $300, Krebs responded immediately. The bidding was becoming heated, competitive. Esperanza was young, attractive despite her current condition, and came with the added value of proven fertility. In the harsh economy of the frontier, she represented a sound investment. As the bids climbed higher, Esperanza closed her eyes and tried to remember her mother's voice singing lullabies in their small adobe house. She remembered the smell of her mother's cooking, the sound of her father's laughter as he worked with the horses, the feeling of safety she had taken for granted until 3 days ago. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else now, a different person who had lived a different life. $500. The voice cut through the auction noise like a knife through silk, quiet but carrying across the entire plaza with unmistakable authority. Every head in the crowd turned toward the source. At the edge of the gathering stood a man, unlike any other in the crowd, tall and lean, with copper-colored skin and long black hair tied back with leather cord. He wore traditional Apache clothing mixed with frontier practicality. His shirt was finely woven cotton, his pants leather, and his boots were handmade with intricate beadwork. A knife hung at his side, and his dark eyes held the kind of stillness that came from years of surviving in harsh country. This was DeSoto, whose name meant he sits down in Apache, earned not from laziness, but from his reputation for patient observation before action. He was known throughout the territory as a scout, tracker, and translator who moved between the Apache Nation and the white settlements with careful neutrality. His services were valued by both sides, though trusted fully by neither. The crowd's reaction was immediate and hostile. "What's that Apache doing here?" someone shouted. "Indians can't bid at white auctions," called another. Several men moved their hands closer to their guns, the casual racism of the frontier turning dangerous in an instant. Wheeler, however, was more interested in profit than prejudice. $500 was more than double the current bid, more than he had expected to get for Esperanza and her child combined. "The bid stands at $500, he announced, though his voice carried uncertainty. "Anyone care to top it?" Krebs stepped forward, his face red with anger. "You can't seriously be considering selling white property to a savage," he snarled. "It ain't natural, it ain't right." His supporters in the crowd murmured agreement, the mood growing uglier by the moment. DeSoto remained perfectly still, his expression unchanged. When he spoke again, his English was precise, educated, with only the slightest accent. "I have gold coin, United States currency, legal tender." He reached into a leather pouch at his belt and withdrew a handful of $20 gold pieces, letting them catch the sunlight. The law recognizes no restriction on who may purchase at public auction. This was technically true, though rarely tested. The Homestead Act and other federal laws did not explicitly prohibit Native Americans from participating in public auctions, though local customs and prejudices usually prevented it. DeSoto had clearly done his research, understanding exactly What legal ground he stood on? Wheeler looked around nervously, caught between his greed and the growing anger of the crowd. $500 would represent the largest single sale of his career, but alienating his regular customers could cost him far more in the long run. "I need to see proof of funds," he said finally, buying time to think. DeSoto stepped forward and poured the gold coins onto a wooden table near the platform. They clinked heavily, unmistakably real. $600, he said calmly. "Cash purchase, no credit, no promises, payment in full upon completion of sale." The crowd erupted. Men shouted challenges and threats. Someone threw a bottle that shattered near DeSoto's feet. "No Indian's gonna own white flesh while I'm breathing," Krebs roared, his hand moving. To his gun. Several other men followed suit, creating a standoff in the middle of the plaza, but DeSoto didn't flinch. His hand rested casually near his knife, but he made no aggressive moves. Instead, he looked directly at Wheeler. "Are you conducting a legal auction or a mob lynching?" he asked, his voice carrying clearly despite the noise. "Because I believe Sheriff Morrison might be interested in the distinction." Wheeler's eyes darted toward the sheriff's office at the far end of the plaza. Sheriff Tom Morrison was known to be fair-minded within the limits of frontier justice, and he had little patience for illegal vigilante activity that might bring federal attention to his town. More importantly, Morrison owed DeSoto several favors for tracking services that had helped capture dangerous outlaws. "The bidding stands at 600, Wheeler announced reluctantly. "Going once." He paused, hoping someone would outbid the Apache and resolve his dilemma. When no one spoke, he continued, "Going twice." The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Krebs made his move. $800, he snarled, "and I'll give you another 100 to never allow Indians at these auctions again." This brought cheers from his supporters, men who worked his mines and depended on his goodwill for their livelihoods. DeSoto considered this for a moment, then reached into another pouch. He counted out more gold coins with deliberate precision. $1,000, he said simply. "Final offer." The plaza fell silent. $1,000 was more money than most of these men saw in 2 years. It was enough to buy a small ranch, a good herd of cattle, or a stake in a profitable mining claim. The idea that an Apache would spend such a sum on purchasing a Mexican woman and her child was beyond their comprehension. Wheeler's greed finally overcame his caution. "Sold," he announced quickly, before anyone could object or the crowd could turn violent. $1,000 to the Apache gentleman. He banged his gavel with finality, though his hand shook as he did it. DeSoto approached the platform with measured steps, ignoring the hostile stares and muttered threats from the crowd. He climbed the wooden steps and stood before Esperanza, who looked up at him with eyes filled with fear and confusion. She had understood enough of the bidding to know her fate had just changed, but not what it meant. "I need the keys to the shackles," DeSoto said to Wheeler, extending his hand. The auctioneer fumbled for the keyring at his belt, his hands still trembling from the tension of the moment. As he unlocked the chains around Esperanza's wrists and ankles, the iron fell away with a sound like breaking bones. Esperanza rubbed her raw wrists, staring at the man who had just purchased her. He was not what she had expected. There was no cruelty in his eyes, no ownership in his expression. Instead, she saw something she had not seen in 3 days. Respect. He looked at her as if she were a person, not property. "Can you walk?" DeSoto asked in Spanish, his accent revealing fluency in her native language. Esperanza nodded, though her legs trembled as she stood. The baby in her arms began to cry again, the sound weak and desperate. DeSoto reached into his travel pack and withdrew a small leather flask. "Water," he said, offering it to her, "for you and the child." Esperanza accepted it gratefully, taking small sips before carefully dripping water between her daughter's lips. "Come," DeSoto said quietly. "We leave now." He offered his arm for support, treating her with the courtesy due to a guest rather than the control expected of property. Together, they walked down the platform steps, through the hostile crowd, and toward the edge of town where 2 horses waited. Behind them, the crowd watched in stunned silence, unsure how to process what they had just witnessed. An Apache had outbid them all, spent a fortune, and now walked away with his purchase as if he owned the very ground beneath his feet. Some muttered about revenge, others about the changing times, but none dared follow. As they reached the horses, Esperanza finally found her voice. "Why?" she whispered in Spanish. "Why did you do this?" Desoda helped her mount the gentler of the 2 horses, ensuring she was secure with her child before answering. "Because no one should be sold like cattle," he replied, swinging onto his own mount, "and because freedom is not something white men own exclusively." He turned his horse toward the desert mountains in the distance. "Now we ride. Your daughter needs proper care, and this town has seen enough of us for one day." The horses moved at a steady pace through the scrubland that stretched endlessly beyond Copper Creek, their hooves creating a rhythmic drumbeat against the hard-packed earth. Esperanza held her daughter close, one arm wrapped protectively around the infant, while the other gripped the saddle horn to maintain her balance. Every step of the horse sent jolts of pain through her body, still healing from childbirth, but she bit her lip and endured it in silence. Desoda rode slightly ahead, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon and the trail behind them. He knew that leaving Copper Creek would not be the end of their troubles. Men like Krebs did not accept defeat gracefully, especially when that defeat came at the hands of someone they considered inferior. The Apache had learned long ago that survival depended on assuming pursuit until proven otherwise. The sun climbed higher, turning the desert air into a furnace that shimmered with heat waves. Esperanza felt sweat mixing with the dried blood on her dress, creating an uncomfortable paste against her skin. Her mouth was dry despite the water Desoda had given her, and she could feel her strength ebbing with each mile they traveled. "We need to stop," she said finally, her voice barely audible over the sound of the horse's breathing. "The baby needs to feed, and I need to rest." She hated showing weakness to this stranger who had spent so much money to acquire her, but her body was reaching its limits. Desoda turned in his saddle to look at her, taking in her pale complexion and the way she swayed slightly with each step of her horse. He had been pushing the pace to put distance between them and Copper Creek, but he could see that she was approaching collapse. Without a word, he guided his horse toward a cluster of large boulders that would provide shade and concealment. He dismounted first, then moved to help Esperanza down from her horse. She accepted his assistance reluctantly, still uncertain of his motives, but too exhausted to maintain her guard. As her feet touched the ground, her knees buckled slightly, and Desoda steadied her with a gentle hand on her elbow. "Sit," he said, guiding her to a flat stone in the shade of the largest boulder. "Rest while I tend to the horses." He spoke in Spanish again, and Esperanza found herself oddly comforted by hearing her native language spoken with such fluency by someone she had expected to be completely foreign to her world. While Desoda unsaddled the horses and led them to a small seep of water hidden among the rocks, Esperanza tried to nurse her daughter, but 3 days of inadequate food and constant stress had taken their toll. She had no milk to offer, and the baby's cries grew weaker and more desperate. Panic began to rise in her chest as she realized her child might die in her arms. Desoda returned with a small leather pouch and a carved wooden cup. "Goat's milk powder," he explained, mixing the white powder with water from his flask. "From the trading post in Tucson. Many Apache women use this when their own milk fails." He offered the cup to her with the same respectful manner he had shown throughout their brief acquaintance. Esperanza accepted the mixture gratefully, using her finger to carefully drip the milk into her daughter's mouth. the baby responded, immediately sucking eagerly at her finger and making small sounds of satisfaction. For the first time in days, Esperanza felt a flicker of hope that her child might survive. As the baby fed and Esperanza regained some of her strength, she studied the man who had bought her freedom at such great cost. De Soto sat cross-legged on the ground nearby, maintaining a respectful distance while keeping watch on the surrounding desert. His clothing and equipment spoke of prosperity, but there was something in his manner that suggested this wealth had been hard-earned rather than inherited. "You are not what I expected," Esperanza said carefully, speaking in Spanish. "When they said an Apache had bought me, I thought—" She trailed off, unwilling to voice the horrible assumptions she had made based on the stories she had heard about Indian raids and captives. De Soto's expression remained neutral, but she caught a flicker of something that might have been pain in his dark eyes. "You thought I would take you to some remote camp and make you a slave to Apache masters instead of white ones," he said quietly. "You thought I bought you for the same reasons any of those men would have." The accuracy of his assessment made Esperanza flush with shame. She had indeed assumed the worst, influenced by years of frontier stories about Apache brutality and the fate of captured women. Now, faced with his obvious intelligence and dignity, those assumptions seemed both ignorant and cruel. "I apologize," she said sincerely. "I should not have judged you by others' words." She adjusted her hold on the baby, who had fallen asleep after feeding. "But I still do not understand why you spent so much money to buy me, if not for the same reasons as the others." De Soto was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains where his people made their homes. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain and hard-won wisdom. 15 years ago, my sister was taken by white raiders. She was about your age, newly married, with a small child. He paused, his jaw tightening with memory. "We tracked them for 3 weeks, following their trail across 2 territories. Esperanza listened in silence, beginning to understand that this story would explain everything about her current situation. The baby stirred in her arms, making small noises in her sleep, and Esperanza instinctively began to rock her gently. When we finally found her, she was in chains in a mining camp north of Phoenix. The white men who owned her had worked her until she could barely stand, and her child had died from neglect and hunger." De Soto's voice remained steady, but Esperanza could hear the fury burning beneath his controlled words. "We offered to buy her back, to trade horses and silver, anything they wanted. They laughed at us and said no Apache money was good enough to purchase white property." The parallel to her own situation was not lost on Esperanza. She had been called white property by the auctioneer, despite her Mexican heritage, simply because she was not Apache. The arbitrary nature of these racial categories and the cruelty they justified was becoming clear to her in a way it never had before. "What happened to her?" Esperanza asked, though she feared the answer. De Soto's expression grew even more grim, and she knew her fears were justified. "We tried to take her by force that night. The camp guards were ready for us. In the fighting that followed, my sister was killed by a stray bullet." He stood abruptly, walking to the edge of their shelter to stare out at the desert. "She died in chains, never knowing freedom again, because I could not pay the price they demanded." Esperanza felt tears running down her cheeks, both for this man's loss and for the recognition of how easily her own story could have ended the same way. "I am sorry for your sister," she said softly, "and I understand now why you helped me." De Soto turned back to her, and for the first time since their meeting, she saw genuine emotion in his face. "I swore that day that if I ever had the chance to buy someone's freedom, I would take it, regardless of the cost. When I heard about the auction in Copper Creek, I knew it was time to keep that promise." As the afternoon heat began to subside, Dasoda returned to his position near Esperanza and began discussing the practical realities of their situation. "We have perhaps 2 hours of daylight left," he said, consulting the position of the sun. "Enough time to reach a safe place where we can spend the night without fear of pursuit." Esperanza nodded, though she still felt weak from the day's ordeal. "Where are you taking me?" she asked. "What happens now that you have bought my freedom?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications about her future and what obligations she might have to this stranger who had spent a fortune on her behalf. "There is a settlement 2 days' ride from here," Dasoda explained. "It is run by a Mexican family named Herrera, people who help those fleeing slavery and persecution. They will provide you with shelter, food, and assistance in deciding what you want to do with your life." He spoke matter-of-factly, as if purchasing someone's freedom and then immediately offering to help them establish independence was the most natural thing in the world. Esperanza stared at him in disbelief. "You are not keeping me? Not taking me to your people as a captive or a wife?" The questions sounded foolish, even as she asked them, but her experience of the world had not prepared her for the concept of genuinely altruistic rescue. "You are free," Dasoda said simply. "That was the point of the purchase. You owe me nothing, and I claim no ownership over you or your child." He began repacking his supplies with efficient movements. "The Herreras will help you contact any family you might have, or assist you in finding work if you choose to remain in the territory." The concept of genuine freedom was so foreign to Esperanza's recent experience that she struggled to accept it. For 3 days, she had been property, her life entirely subject to the whims of others. Before that, as an unmarried woman in a traditional Mexican family, her choices had been limited by custom and expectation. The idea that she could simply decide her own fate seemed impossible. "What if I have no family left?" she asked quietly. "What if there is nowhere for me to go?" The raiders who had taken her had been thorough in their destruction of the Valdez. A ranch. She had no way of knowing if any of her extended family had survived or would be willing to take in a woman with an illegitimate child. "Then you make a new life," Dasoda replied without hesitation. "The Herreras have helped many people start over. Some work on their ranch, others start businesses in town, still others move on to California or back to Mexico. The choice will be yours alone." Esperanza felt a strange mixture of terror and exhilaration at this prospect. The freedom to choose her own path was something she had never experienced, but it also meant accepting complete responsibility for her decisions and their consequences. "And my daughter?" she asked, looking down at the sleeping infant in her arms. "She will grow up free," Dasoda said firmly. "She will never know chains or auctions or the fear of being sold. That alone makes everything I spent worthwhile." There was a fierce satisfaction in his voice, as if he had struck a blow against the entire system that had destroyed his sister and nearly destroyed Esperanza. As they prepared to resume their journey, Dasoda helped Esperanza mount her horse, again ensuring that she was comfortable and secure with the baby. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant lower in the sky, painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and amber that softened the harsh edges of the scrubland. "The place we are going is called Esperanza Springs," Dasoda said as they began to ride. It was named by the first Mexican settlers who found water there during a drought. They said it represented hope in the wilderness. He glanced at her meaningfully. "Perhaps it is fitting that you share the name." Esperanza, whose name indeed meant hope in Spanish, found herself smiling for the first time in days. Her parents had chosen the name during a difficult period in their lives, saying that she represented their faith in better times to come. Now riding through the desert toward an uncertain but self-determined future, she began to understand what they had meant. The trail wound through increasingly varied terrain as they traveled, following ancient paths that had been used by Apache, Mexican, and Anglo travelers for generations. DeSoto pointed out landmarks and explained the geography, treating her as an equal companion rather than cargo he was transporting. "You know this country well," Esperanza observed, as they navigated around a particularly rocky section of the trail. "Have you lived here all your life?" She was genuinely curious about this man who had appeared in her darkest moment like an answer to prayer. "I was born in these mountains," DeSoto replied, gesturing toward the peaks visible in the distance. "But I have traveled extensively throughout the territory and beyond. I learned English at a mission school in New Mexico, and I have worked as a scout and translator for both Apache leaders and territorial officials." This explained his education and obvious prosperity, but it also raised new questions about his position in a world where Apache and Anglo cultures were often in violent conflict. "That must be a difficult path to walk," Esperanza said carefully. "Serving both sides in a war." DeSoto's expression grew thoughtful. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. There are those among my people who consider me a traitor for working with whites, and those among the whites who will never trust an Apache regardless of my service. But I believe that understanding between peoples is the only path to peace, even if that understanding comes slowly and at great cost." As the sun set behind them, painting the sky in brilliant shades of red and orange, they crested a small hill and saw their destination in the distance. Esperanza Springs appeared as a cluster of adobe buildings surrounded by green fields that seemed impossible in the midst of the desert. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the warm glow of lanterns could be seen in windows. "It looks like paradise," Esperanza whispered, overwhelmed by the sight of civilization and safety after the horrors of recent days. Her daughter stirred in her arms as if sensing her mother's relief and hope. "It is a good place," DeSoto agreed. "The Herreras are good people who believe, as I do, that freedom is a gift that should be shared rather than hoarded." He urged his horse forward down the gentle slope toward the settlement. "Come, let us see what tomorrow will bring." As they approached the welcoming lights of Esperanza Springs, both riders carried with them the weight of the day's revelations and the promise of possibilities neither had imagined when the sun first rose over Copper Creek. Behind them, the desert stretched endlessly under a canopy of emerging stars, holding its ancient secrets and infinite potential for both cruelty and redemption. The adobe buildings of Esperanza Springs glowed like beacons in the gathering darkness as DeSoto and Esperanza approached the settlement. Unlike the harsh commercial atmosphere of Copper Creek, this place radiated warmth and community. Children played in the dusty streets despite the late hour, their laughter carrying on the desert breeze, while adults gathered on covered porches to share the day's news and escape the lingering heat. The main house was larger than the others, built in the traditional Mexican style with thick walls and a red tile roof that had somehow survived. The harsh desert climate. Flowering vines climbed wooden posts that supported a wide veranda, and the soft glow of oil lamps illuminated carved wooden furniture where several people sat talking in quiet voices. As the horses' hoofbeats announced their arrival, a woman emerged from the main house and walked toward them with confident strides. This was Rosa Herrera, matriarch of the settlement and a force of nature despite her small stature. Her grey hair was pulled back in a severe bun, but her dark eyes sparkled with intelligence and compassion. She wore a simple brown dress that spoke of practicality rather than fashion, and her weathered hands suggested a lifetime of hard work. DeSoto She called out in Spanish, her voice carrying both greeting and concern. "We were not expecting you for another month." Her gaze moved to Esperanza and the bundle in her arms, taking in the blood-stained dress, the exhaustion written across the young woman's face, and the protective way she held her child. Dasoda dismounted and moved to help Esperanza down from a horse. "There was an auction in Copper Creek," he said simply. "This is Esperanza Valdez and her daughter. They need sanctuary." The brevity of his explanation spoke volumes to Rosa, who had been running this refuge for escapees and displaced persons for over a decade. Rosa approached Esperanza with the gentle manner of someone accustomed to dealing with traumatized. "My people." "Welcome to our home, mija," she said softly, using the affectionate diminutive that marked her as a surrogate mother to countless souls who had found their way to this place. "You are safe here. No one will harm you or your baby." Esperanza looked between Rosa and Dasoda, still struggling to believe that such kindness could exist without hidden motives. The baby in her arms began to fuss, hungry again despite the feeding during their rest stop. "She needs milk," Esperanza said weakly, swaying slightly on her feet. "Of course she does," Rosa said briskly, taking charge of the situation with the efficiency of long practice. "And you need food, rest, and a proper medical attention." She called out in rapid Spanish to several people on the veranda, who immediately sprang into action. "Maria, prepare the room next to the kitchen. Juan, see to the horses. Carmen, heat water for bathing and bring the goat's milk from the storehouse." Within minutes, Esperanza found herself being gently guided into the main house while people bustled around her with quiet efficiency. The interior was cool and welcoming, with thick walls that kept out the desert heat and hand-woven rugs that covered polished wooden floors. Religious icons and family photographs adorned the walls, creating an atmosphere of stability and continuity. Rosa led her to a small but comfortable room that contained a real bed, with clean white sheets, a wooden cradle that looked recently made, and a washstand with fresh towels. "This will be your room for as long as you need it," Rosa said, helping Esperanza sit on the edge of the bed. "No one will ask you to leave before you are ready." As several women from the settlement worked to make Esperanza comfortable, bringing warm food, clean clothes, and supplies for the baby, Rosa sat in a chair beside the bed and listened to the full story of the past few days. Esperanza spoke haltingly at first, still processing the trauma of losing her family, being kidnapped and sold at auction. "The raiders came just before dawn," Esperanza began, her voice barely above a whisper as she nursed her daughter with milk provided by the settlement's goats. "My father heard the horses and tried to warn us, but there were too many of them. They killed him in the doorway, and my mother died trying to protect me." Tears ran down her cheeks as she relived the horror of that morning. Rosa listened, without interruption, her experienced eye taking note of the signs of trauma and exhaustion that marked this young woman. She had seen hundreds of refugees over the years, each carrying their own burden of loss and fear, but something about Esperanza's story struck her as particularly significant. "They kept me alive because I was pregnant," Esperanza continued. "The leader, a man named Cortez, said I would be worth more at auction with a baby to prove my fertility. They made me walk behind their horses for 2 days, even when the labor pains started. When my daughter was born, they didn't even let me rest before putting us both in chains." The women attending to Esperanza exchanged dark looks at this recounting. Many of them had their own stories of escape from slavery, forced labor, or abusive situations. They understood the particular cruelty involved in exploiting a woman's most vulnerable moments for profit. Rosa's expression grew grimmer as the story continued. "This Cortez, did he say anything about where they planned to take other captives? Were there others?" Her questions were not driven by idle curiosity, but by the practical need to understand the scope of the threat these raiders represented. Esperanza shook her head slowly. I think I was the only survivor from our ranch. But one of the men mentioned other raids, other auctions. They spoke of it like a business, with regular customers and scheduled sales. The casual nature of the human trafficking operation was perhaps more disturbing than random violence would have been. While Esperanza rested and fed her child, Dasoda sat on the veranda with Rosa's husband, Miguel Herrera, discussing the broader implications of what had transpired in Copper Creek. Miguel was a former vaquero whose family had been driven from their land by Anglo settlers, leading him to establish this sanctuary for others facing similar displacement. The fact that they held a public auction suggests they feel secure in their operations, Miguel observed, stroking his graying beard thoughtfully. Either they have official protection, or they believe the local authorities will not interfere with their business. Both possibilities were troubling for different reasons. Dasoda nodded grimly. The sheriff in Copper Creek seems honest enough, but he's outnumbered by men who profit from this trade. And the territorial government has bigger concerns than the fate of Mexican families or Apache captives. The reality of frontier justice was that it often failed to protect the most vulnerable members of society. The peaceful atmosphere of Esperanza Springs was shattered the next morning when a rider arrived with disturbing news. Carlos Mendoza, a young man who worked as a courier between various Mexican settlements, brought word that armed men had been asking questions about Dasoda and a Mexican woman with a baby. They're offering a $50 reward for information. Carlos reported to the gathered adults of the settlement. The leader matches the description of the man Cortez that the Senora mentioned. They claim she's stolen property that belongs to them. The legal fiction that Esperanza remained property, despite being sold at public auction, revealed the extent of corruption in the system. Rosa's face hardened with anger. Property does not steal itself, she said sharply. A human being cannot be property, regardless of what papers these bandits claim to possess. Her moral certainty was shared by everyone in the settlement, but they all understood that their principles might not protect them from armed men seeking profit. Miguel called an emergency meeting of the settlement's adult residents to discuss their response to this threat. The community had faced similar situations before, but never with such a high-profile rescue and such determined pursuit. They gathered in the main room of the house, men and women who had built this refuge through years of collective effort and mutual support. We have several options, Miguel said, addressing the group. We can hide Esperanza and hope they give up the search. We can try to negotiate with them, perhaps offering to buy her freedom again. Or we can prepare to defend our home if they attempt to take her by force. Each option carried significant risks for the entire community. Dasoda, who had been invited to participate in the discussion despite being an outsider, spoke up with characteristic directness. They will not negotiate. Men like Cortez see any compromise as weakness to be exploited, and hiding will only work temporarily. They have the resources to search systematically until they find her. The room fell silent as the implications of his words sank in. If peaceful solutions were not viable, they were facing the prospect of armed conflict with a group of professional raiders who made their living through violence and intimidation. An older man named Fernando, who had lost his own family to similar raiders years earlier, stood to address the group. I say we fight, he declared, his weathered hands clenched into fists. These settlements exist because we refuse to bow to those who would enslave us. If we surrender this woman and her child, we surrender everything we have built here. His words stirred murmurs of agreement from several others, but Rosa held up her hand for silence. Fighting is easy to talk about and hard to survive, she said with the authority of someone who had seen too much violence. We have children here, families to protect. We cannot make decisions based on anger alone. Esperanza, who had been listening from the doorway with her daughter in her arms, stepped forward to address the group. "I will not be the cause of bloodshed among people who have shown me such kindness," she said firmly. "If my presence brings danger to your families, I will leave. Better that I face whatever comes alone than drag innocent people into my troubles." Rosa turned to face Esperanza with fierce determination. "Mija, you misunderstand the nature of this place," she said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "We do not abandon people who seek our protection. Every person in this room has been where you are now, facing impossible choices with nowhere else to turn. We stand together or we fall separately." The murmurs of agreement that followed this declaration revealed the deep bonds that held the community together. These were not just neighbors, but survivors who had found in each other the family and security that the outside world had denied. De Soto stood and addressed the group with formal courtesy. "I brought this danger to your door," he said. "If you will permit it, I will take Esperanza and her child elsewhere, perhaps to California or into Mexico proper. My presence here only makes you a larger target for both Cortez and the territorial authorities." Miguel shook his head firmly. "Your presence here is welcome for as long as you choose to stay," he replied, "and moving constantly with a newborn infant is no solution. The child needs stability and medical care that only a settled community can provide." After hours of discussion, the community reached a consensus that surprised no one who knew their history and values. They would not surrender Esperanza or abandon their principles, but they would take practical steps to defend themselves and minimize the risk to non-combatants. The plan they developed reflected both their idealism and their hard-earned pragmatism. The women, children, and elderly would be moved to a secondary location in the nearby hills, where they could remain safe while still close enough to return quickly if the danger passed. The able-bodied men, along with any women who chose to fight, would remain in the settlement to face whatever came. Esperanza watched these preparations with a mixture of gratitude and guilt, amazed that complete strangers would risk so much for her safety. "Why?" she asked Rosa as they packed supplies for the evacuation. "Why are you willing to sacrifice so much for someone you barely know?" Rosa paused in her work and looked directly into Esperanza's eyes. "Because today it is you who needs our help," she said simply. "Tomorrow it may be one of us who needs yours. This is how communities survive in a hostile world, by protecting each other regardless of the personal cost." As night fell over Esperanza Springs, the settlement took on the appearance of a military camp preparing for siege. Weapons were cleaned and distributed, watch schedules were established, and defensive positions were identified. But beneath the preparations for conflict, the community's essential character remained unchanged, a place where human dignity was valued above profit and where freedom was considered worth any sacrifice. Esperanza sat in her room, nursing her daughter, and watching the quiet efficiency of the preparations outside her window. For the first time since her ordeal began, she felt not like a burden or a piece of property, but like a member of a family willing to fight for her protection. The feeling was both humbling and empowering, a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, human goodness could still prevail. Dawn broke over Esperanza Springs with an eerie stillness that seemed to press against the settlement like a held breath. The usual sounds of morning activity were muted as the community's defenders took their positions around the perimeter, while the non-combatants made their final preparations for withdrawal to the hidden canyon Miguel had prepared in the foothills. Esperanza stood at her window, watching Rosa organize the evacuation with military precision. Children were bundled into wagons alongside elderly residents and essential supplies, their faces reflecting confusion about why their normal routines had been so suddenly disrupted. Mothers whispered reassurances while casting worried glances. toward the men checking their rifles and positioning themselves behind hastily constructed barricades. "You should go with them," De Soto said quietly, entering the room without his usual knock. He carried his own rifle and wore the traditional Apache war paint that transformed his face into a mask of controlled fury. "Your daughter needs you alive more than this place needs another defender." Esperanza turned from the window, her own face set with determination that had grown stronger during her nights of reflection in this sanctuary. "This community risked everything to protect me," she replied, checking the small pistol Miguel had given her the previous evening. "I will not abandon them when the consequences of that choice arrive at their door." The baby slept peacefully in the wooden cradle, oblivious to the tension that filled every corner of the settlement. Esperanza had already made arrangements for her daughter's care if the worst should happen, entrusting her to Maria Santos, the settlement's midwife, who would accompany the evacuation group to ensure the infant received proper medical attention. Outside, Miguel's voice could be heard giving final instructions to the defenders. "Remember, we are not trying to win a war," he called out to the 23 men and women who had chosen to remain. "We are buying time for our families to reach safety and demonstrating that this community will not be intimidated by raiders and slavers." The evacuation convoy began moving just as the sun cleared the eastern mountains, creating long shadows that provided additional concealment for their departure route. Rosa kissed Miguel goodbye with the stoic acceptance of a woman who had faced such partings before, then climbed onto the lead wagon without looking back. Esperanza watched until the last wagon disappeared into the maze of rocky arroyos that would hide their passage, then turned her attention to the approaching dust cloud visible on the southern horizon. Cortez and his men were coming, and they would arrive within the hour. The dust cloud resolved into individual riders as Cortez's band approached Esperanza Springs with the confident arrogance of men who had never encountered serious resistance. To their predations, there were 12 of them, hard-faced veterans of the border conflicts who treated violence as a business tool and human suffering as an acceptable cost of profit. Cortez himself rode at the front, a large man whose expensive clothing and well-maintained weapons spoke of the success his criminal enterprise had achieved. His face bore the scars of numerous fights, and his eyes held the cold calculation of someone who had long ago abandoned any pretense of moral constraint. He raised his hand to halt his men at the edge of rifle range, studying the settlement's defensive preparations with professional interest. "Well now," he called out in accented English that carried clearly across the distance separating the two groups. "Looks like our little bird has found herself a nest full of protectors." His tone suggested amusement rather than concern, as if he found the settlers' resistance more entertaining than threatening. Miguel stepped forward from behind the main barricade, his rifle held ready but not directly aimed at the raiders. "You are not welcome here, Cortez," he shouted back. "Turn around and leave, and there will be no bloodshed today." His offer of peaceful resolution was made without any expectation of acceptance, but protocol demanded it be offered. Cortez laughed, a sound devoid of humor that echoed across the settlement like the caw of a carrion bird. "I'm afraid that's not possible, amigo," he replied. "I have a legal claim to retrieve stolen property, and I intend to exercise that right." He gestured to one of his men, who produced an official-looking document from his saddlebags. "We have a bill of sale, signed and witnessed, proving ownership of one Mexican female and infant child," Cortez continued, waving the paper theatrically. "The territorial government recognizes such documents, and interference with their enforcement constitutes a federal crime." The legal fiction was transparent, but it provided enough cover for his actions to discourage official intervention. From her position behind a wooden barrier near the main house, Esperanza felt rage building in her chest as she listened to herself and her daughter being discussed like livestock. The casual dehumanization in Cortez's voice reminded her of the auctioneer in Copper Creek, reducing her existence to a commercial transaction. De Soda, positioned on the roof of the stable where his rifle could command the widest field of fire, called out in Apache before switching to English. "Your paper means nothing here, Cortez. The woman was freed by legal purchase. She owes you nothing." His voice carried across the settlement with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Ah, the noble Apache speaks," Cortez sneered, his gaze finding De Soda's position with practiced ease. "I remember you from Copper Creek, Indian. Caused quite a stir with your theatrical gesture. But this is not a public auction with rules and witnesses. This is the open desert, where different laws apply." The threat was unmistakable, and Miguel knew that negotiations had reached their end. "You have had your say, Cortez," he called out. "Now leave our land, or face the consequences of trespassing." His rifle moved almost imperceptibly, coming to bear on the raider leader's center mass. Cortez's expression hardened as he realized the settlers were not going to be intimidated into surrender. "So be it," he snarled, raising his hand to signal. His men, "Take the woman alive, but kill anyone who stands in your way. There's no law out here except what we make ourselves." The first shot came from Cortez's second-in-command, a thin man with quick hands and a reputation for marksmanship that proved justified as his bullets splintered the wood inches from Miguel's head. The settlement's defenders responded immediately, their rifles speaking in a ragged volley that sent two raiders tumbling from their saddles. The peaceful morning air filled with gun smoke and the sharp crack of rifle fire as both sides sought cover and tried to gain tactical advantage. Cortez's men had expected token resistance at best, but they quickly discovered that these settlers were not helpless refugees, but experienced fighters who had learned hard lessons about survival on the frontier. Esperanza found herself crouched behind a water trough, her pistol ready but her hands shaking with adrenaline and fear. She had never been in a gunfight before, had never even fired a weapon in anger, but the sound of bullets whistling overhead crystallized her determination to never again be helpless in the face of violence. Two of Cortez's men attempted to flank the settlement's main defensive line by circling around through the cornfield that provided food for the community. Their movement was spotted by Carmen Herrera, Miguel's eldest daughter, who had inherited her father's eye for tactical situations. Her warning shout allowed Fernando and two other defenders to reposition themselves to meet this threat. The flanking attempt turned into a deadly game of hide-and-seek among the tall cornstalks, with both sides trying to locate their opponents without exposing themselves to return fire. The raiders had superior training and equipment, but the defenders knew every inch of their ground and used that knowledge to deadly effect. De Soda's position on the stable roof allowed him to observe the entire battlefield and coordinate the defender's response to Cortez's tactical moves. His rifle spoke with methodical precision, each shot carefully aimed to maximize its effect on enemy morale as well as their numbers. He had learned warfare from Apache masters who viewed each bullet as precious and waste as potentially fatal. One of the raiders, frustrated by the stubborn resistance, charged directly at the main barricade with his pistol blazing and a Bowie knife clenched between his teeth. His courage was admirable, but his tactics were suicidal as three rifles spoke simultaneously and dropped him 10 feet short of his target. The battle's tide began to turn when Cortez realized that his men were taking casualties at an unsustainable rate while making no progress toward their objective. The settlers' defensive positions were too strong, their coordination too effective, and their motivation too fierce for a frontal assault to succeed. "Fall back to the rocks," he shouted to his remaining men, pointing toward a cluster of boulders that would provide better cover while allowing them to maintain their siege of the settlement. "We'll wait them out. They can't have supplies for more than a few days." The withdrawal to the boulder field marked the beginning of a new phase in the conflict, one that favored neither side clearly but promised to test the endurance and resolve of everyone involved. Cortez's remaining 8 men established positions among the rocks that protected them from the defenders' rifles, while maintaining clear fields of fire toward the settlement. Miguel took advantage of the lull in active fighting to assess their situation and tend to their wounded. 3 defenders had been hit during the initial exchange, though none seriously enough to be removed from the fight. Their supplies of ammunition and food were adequate for several days, but water might become a problem if the siege extended. Beyond a week, they're trying to starve us out, Miguel observed to De Soto during a brief consultation in the main house. Cortez knows he can't take us by direct assault, so he's settling in for a waiting game. The strategy was logical from the raiders' perspective, as they could afford to be patient while the defenders had families to worry about. Esperanza had proven herself during the battle, her pistol accounting for at least 1 raider who had tried to approach her position too closely. The experience of combat had burned away the last vestiges of the helpless victim she had been in Copper Creek, replacing that identity with something harder and more self-reliant. "I want to try something," she announced during the afternoon planning session, her voice carrying a confidence that surprised even herself. "Cortez wants me alive because I represent money to him. What if I offered to surrender myself in exchange for your safety?" Dirty. The immediate chorus of rejection from every defender made clear that this option would not be considered under any circumstances. "You are not a bargaining chip," Miguel said firmly. "You are a member of this community, and we do not trade our people to raiders for any reason." De Soto's response was even more direct. "Cortez would take you and then attack anyway," he stated flatly. "Men like him view mercy as weakness and agreements as tools to be discarded when convenient. Your sacrifice would accomplish nothing except to ensure your return to slavery." As the afternoon wore on, both sides engaged in sporadic exchanges of gunfire that served more to maintain tension than to achieve tactical objectives. The raiders occasionally attempted to probe the settlement's defenses, looking for weak points or opportunities for infiltration, but the defenders remained alert and coordinated in their response. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. The psychological strain of the standoff began to tell. On both sides, as the sun reached its zenith and the desert heat made every position uncomfortable. Water became a precious commodity that had to be rationed carefully, while the constant vigilance required to watch for enemy movement left everyone exhausted. Evening brought little relief from either the heat or the tension, as both sides settled in for what promised to be a long night of mutual surveillance and sporadic violence. Cortez had clearly decided that time was on his side, confident that the defenders would eventually be worn down by fatigue and dwindling supplies. But as darkness fell over Esperanza Springs, De Soto began to implement a plan that would use his Apache heritage and training to turn the tables on the besieging raiders. The night belonged to those who knew how to move silently through hostile territory, and few were better at such movement than an Apache warrior defending what he considered his own. "Tonight, we stop waiting for them to make the first move," he announced to the gathered defenders. "Tonight we remind Cortez that he is not the only predator in this desert." His smile in the lamplight held no warmth, only the promise of retribution for those who had brought violence to this place of sanctuary. As midnight approached, De Soto prepared for the kind of warfare his people had perfected over centuries, of conflict with enemies who possessed superior numbers and firepower. He removed his boots and shirt, darkening his exposed skin with mud and charcoal to blend with the desert shadows. His movements were methodical, ritualistic, transforming him from the educated translator who had purchased Esperanza's freedom into something far more primal and dangerous. Miguel watched these preparations with fascination, tinged by unease. He had fought alongside Apache scouts during his younger days as a vaquero, but he had never witnessed the complete transformation that occurred when a warrior prepared for night hunting. "What exactly are you planning?" he asked quietly, not wanting to disturb the concentration visible in every line of De Soto's body. "Cortez has 8 men left," De Soto replied, testing the edge of his knife against his thumb. "They feel safe in their rock fortress because they can see anyone approaching across open ground during daylight. But darkness changes the equation completely." He gathered several items from his pack: thin leather cords, small metal objects that looked like bells, and a collection of throwing knives that gleamed dully in the lamplight. Esperanza entered the room as he completed his preparations, her daughter sleeping peacefully in her arms despite the ongoing siege. The sight of De Soto in full warrior regalia stopped her short, reminding her that beneath his civilized exterior lay something far older and more elemental than the frontier culture that surrounded them. "You are going to try to kill them all," she said, not asking, but stating what seemed obvious from his preparations. 8 men against 1. Those are terrible odds, even for someone with your skills. Her concern was genuine, born from the recognition that this man had risked everything to save her and now proposed to risk even more. De Soto paused in his preparations to look directly at her. "I am not going to try to kill them all," he corrected gently. "I'm going to succeed in killing them all. There is a difference between attempting something and committing to its completion." The certainty in his voice was absolute, carrying no trace of boasting or false bravado. The plan he outlined to the settlement's defenders was elegantly simple in concept, but required precise execution to succeed. He would use the darkness and his knowledge of Apache stealth techniques to eliminate the raiders one by one, starting with the sentries and working his way toward Cortez himself. The key was to strike silently and quickly, preventing any alarm that might alert the remaining enemies. "What if something goes wrong?" Miguel asked, voicing the concern they all felt about relying so heavily on a single man's abilities. "What if they spot you before you can complete your mission?" "The consequences of failure would be catastrophic for everyone in the settlement. Then you will know, because the shooting will start again," De Soto replied pragmatically. "In that case, attack immediately, while they are confused and disorganized. Do not wait to see what happens to me." He gathered his weapons and moved toward the door with the fluid grace of a hunting cat. Esperanza stopped him with a gentle touch on his arm. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "You have already done more than anyone could expect. You could slip away in the darkness and be safe." The question had been troubling her since the siege began, this willingness of strangers to risk their lives for her freedom. De Soto's answer came without hesitation. "Because some things are worth dying for, and human freedom is one of them. Because my sister never had a chance to live free, but your daughter will." He touched her hand briefly, then melted into the darkness outside the house like a shadow rejoining its source. The desert night was alive with sounds that most people never noticed: the rustle of small creatures moving through the brush, the whisper of wind across stone, the distant cry of a hunting owl. De Soto moved through this landscape like a part of it, his bare feet finding silent purchase on surfaces that would have betrayed any other man's approach. The raiders had posted 2 sentries, one watching the settlement and another scanning the approaches from the opposite direction. They were competent men who understood their business, but they were accustomed to fighting other white men who approached conflict with European tactics and assumptions. They had no experience with Apache methods of warfare. The first sentry died without ever knowing he was in danger, De Soto's knife sliding between his ribs with surgical precision, while a hand clamped over his mouth prevented any outcry. The body was lowered silently to the ground and arranged to look like a man sleeping at his post, buying precious time before the death would be discovered. The second sentry proved more challenging, positioned where he could observe both his dead companion and the surrounding terrain. De Soto spent nearly an hour working his way into position, moving inches at a time across ground that offered minimal concealment. When he finally struck, it was with a thrown knife that took the man in the throat, dropping him instantly but not silently. The soft thud of the falling body alerted one of the sleeping raiders, who called out sleepily to ask if everything was all right. De Soto immediately mimicked the dead sentry's voice, grunting an affirmative response in the kind of slurred tone a tired man might use. The ruse worked, and the questioner settled back into his blankets without investigating further. Moving deeper into the raiders' camp required even greater care, as the remaining men were sleeping close together around the embers of a carefully shielded fire. Each had to be killed silently, without alerting the others, and without leaving obvious signs of violence that might be spotted by chance. It was the most challenging form of combat, requiring not just skill, but perfect self-control. The third man died with a cord around his throat, strangled so quietly that his death throes were barely audible above the normal sounds of the desert night. The fourth was dispatched with another thrown knife, this one taking him in the heart as he shifted in his sleep. Each killing brought De Soto closer to his ultimate target, while reducing the odds against the settlement's survival. Cortez himself proved to be a light sleeper with good instincts, waking just as De Soto approached his position near the center of the camp. But instead of calling out or reaching for his gun, the raider leader lay perfectly still, listening and evaluating the situation with the patience of an experienced predator. This was the moment of greatest danger, when discovery would mean fighting 6 men simultaneously in close quarters. "I know you're there, Apache," Cortez whispered finally, his voice barely audible but carrying clearly in the still air. "Impressive work on my sentries, but you've made a mistake coming this close." His hand moved slowly toward the revolver lying beside his bedroll, telegraphing his intention while trying to buy time. De Soto's response was immediate and decisive. Instead of retreating or attempting further stealth, he launched himself directly at Cortez with a war cry that shattered the desert silence and announced the beginning of open combat. The element of surprise was lost, but 4 of the 8 enemies were already dead, and the odds had shifted dramatically in favor of survival. The remaining raiders reacted to De Soto's war cry with the reflexes of professional fighters, rolling away from their blankets and reaching for weapons, even as they tried to understand what was happening in the darkness around them. But confusion and disorientation worked against them, as they could not immediately distinguish friend from foe in the chaos of close combat. Cortez managed to draw his revolver and fire 2 shots at the Apache warrior, both missing in the darkness but providing enough muzzle flash to reveal De Soto's position to the other raiders. Return fire from the settlement's defenders immediately answered these shots, as Miguel and his people recognized the signal to begin their assault on the raider camp. The battle that followed was unlike the daylight engagement that had preceded it. This was close, desperate fighting in darkness, punctuated by muzzle flashes that created brief strobing glimpses of the carnage. Men fought with knives and pistols at distances measured in feet rather than yards, making marksmanship less important than raw courage and the will to survive. Esperanza had followed the other defenders in their charge across the open ground, her own pistol ready despite Miguel's attempts to convince her to remain in the settlement. The woman who had knelt in chains on an auction block was gone, replaced by someone who would never again allow others to fight for her freedom while she waited passively for the outcome. She found herself face to face with one of the surviving raiders, a bearded man whose eyes reflected the same desperate determination she felt burning in her own chest. They fired simultaneously, his bullet tugging at her dress, while hers took him center mass and dropped him to the rocky ground. The moment crystallized everything she had learned about survival and self-reliance. Cortez proved to be as dangerous in defeat as he had been in command, fighting with the fury of a man who had built his entire identity around dominance and control. He and DeSoto circled each other among the rocks like wolves, each looking for the opening that would end the combat decisively. Blood flowed from wounds on both men, testament to the skill and determination each brought to this final encounter. "You've cost me everything, Apache," Cortez snarled as they grappled hand to hand, knives locked between them in a test of pure strength. "Years of work, a profitable business, the respect of my men. I should have killed you in Copper Creek when I had the chance." His voice carried the rage of someone whose world was collapsing around him. DeSoto's response came through gritted teeth as he fought to drive his blade home against Cortez's desperate resistance. "Your business was built on human suffering," he replied. "Your respect was earned through fear and cruelty. The world will be better without both." The moral certainty in his voice matched the physical determination in his muscles. The end came suddenly, as such endings often do. Cortez's strength failed at the crucial moment, allowing DeSoto's knife to find its mark between his ribs. The raider leader's eyes widened with shock and something that might have been regret before he collapsed to the ground, his blood mixing with the desert sand that had witnessed so much violence over the centuries. Dawn revealed the true cost of the night's fighting as the defenders of Esperanza Springs surveyed the battlefield among the rocks. All 8 of Cortez's men lay dead, their threat to the settlement permanently ended, but the victory had not come without price. 3 of the community's defenders had been wounded, one seriously enough to require immediate medical attention. DeSoto sat on a boulder, allowing Carmen Herrera to clean and bandage the knife wounds he had sustained during his fight with Cortez. His transformation back from warrior to civilized man was gradual, the hard edges of combat discipline slowly giving way to the thoughtful demeanor that characterized his usual interactions. Esperanza approached him, carrying her daughter, who had slept through most of the night's violence in the safety of the settlement's main house. "It is finished?" she asked, though the silence from the raider camp made the answer obvious. "They will not be coming back for me." The relief in her voice was mixed with something deeper, a recognition that her old life was truly over. "It is finished," DeSoto confirmed, accepting a cup of water from one of the other defenders. "Cortez and his men will raid no more settlements, take no more captives, sell no more human beings at auction." He looked out across the desert where vultures were already beginning to circle, drawn by the scent of death. The evacuation group returned to Esperanza Springs by mid-morning, having heard the distant gunfire and correctly interpreted its meaning. Rosa Herrera embraced her husband with tears of relief, while children ran through the settlement, calling out the names of friends and family members to ensure everyone had survived the night. Miguel called the community together for a memorial service honoring the 3 defenders who had given their lives to protect the settlement's principles. Their names would be carved into the wooden cross that marked the community's cemetery, joining others who had died defending the refuge over the years. The cost of freedom was never cheap, but these people had long ago decided it was worth paying. As the community began the process of returning to normal life, Esperanza found herself facing the question that had been postponed by the immediate crisis. What would she do now that she was truly free? The raiders were dead, her legal status was secure, and the future stretched before her like an unmarked trail across the desert. "You could stay here," Rosa suggested as they worked together preparing the evening meal. "We always need more hands, and your daughter would grow up surrounded by people who understand the value of freedom." The offer was genuine, backed by the kind of acceptance that could only be earned through shared danger. But Esperanza had been thinking about more than just her own future during the long hours of siege and battle. "I want to do what you have done here," she said finally. "I want to help other people who are running from slavery and violence. But I think there are places that need such help more than Esperanza Springs already provides." Her vision was broader than simple personal safety. De Soda, who had been listening to their conversation while cleaning his weapons, looked up with interest. "What did you have in mind?" he asked. "There are many places on the frontier where such sanctuaries could make a difference, but establishing them requires resources and determination that not everyone possesses." His tone suggested he was evaluating her commitment rather than discouraging her plans. Esperanza's answer revealed how much she had changed during her journey from captive to free woman to defender of others' freedom. "I want to build something like this in New Mexico, near where my family's ranch used to be. There are others like me, Mexican families being raided and sold, who need somewhere safe to rebuild their lives." Her voice carried the same certainty that had marked De Soda's promise to eliminate the raiders. The plan that emerged from their discussion represented a new chapter in the ongoing struggle against human trafficking on the frontier. Esperanza would take her infant daughter and travel to New Mexico with De Soda's assistance, using the knowledge and resources she had gained at Esperanza Springs to establish a new sanctuary for refugees from slavery and violence. As the sun set over the desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to bless their plans, three people sat planning a future built on the foundation of human dignity and mutual aid. The woman who had been sold in chains while still bleeding from childbirth had become someone who would ensure others never faced such degradation, while the Apache warrior who had bought her freedom had found a cause worthy of his continued dedication. 6 months after the battle at Esperanza Springs, the high desert of northern New Mexico witnessed the birth of something unprecedented in the territory's violent history. Where the Valdez family ranch had once stood, destroyed by Cortez's raiders, a new settlement was rising from the ashes of tragedy. But this was not merely a rebuilding of what had been lost. It was the creation of something entirely new, a beacon of hope for the displaced and enslaved throughout the borderlands. Esperanza stood on the covered porch of the main house, her daughter Isabel playing at her feet with wooden toys carved by the settlement's carpenter. The child had grown strong and healthy during their months of travel and construction, her laughter a constant reminder of why this work mattered. At 8 months old, Isabel would have no memory of the auction block or the chains that had bound her mother, knowing only the freedom that so many had sacrificed to secure. The settlement that surrounded them bore little resemblance to a traditional ranch or Mexican village. Instead, it had been designed from the beginning as a sanctuary and way station for those fleeing bondage. The buildings were arranged in a defensive pattern learned from Apache military architecture, with multiple escape routes and hidden supply caches that could sustain the population during siege. Every structure served dual purposes. The chapel doubled as a schoolhouse, the granary included a hidden medical facility, and the stables connected to underground tunnels. De Soda emerged from the workshop where he had been training the settlements, defenders in traditional Apache combat techniques. His role in the community had evolved beyond that of military advisor to something approaching co-founder, his wisdom and experience proving invaluable in navigating the complex challenges of establishing a refuge in hostile territory. The territorial government maintained an official policy of neutrality toward their activities, but everyone understood how quickly that could change. "The new arrivals are settling in well," he reported, settling into a chair beside Esperanza, as they watched the afternoon activities of their growing community. The family from El Paso brought useful skills in metalworking, and the woman from Tucson has experience in organizing underground networks. Each new refugee brought not just another mouth to feed, but valuable knowledge and abilities that strengthened the whole. The community they had built together defied easy categorization by the standards of frontier society. It was neither entirely Mexican nor Apache, neither strictly traditional nor completely modern. Instead, it represented a fusion of cultures and ideas, united by the shared commitment to human dignity and mutual aid. Spanish was spoken alongside Apache and English. Catholic prayers were offered beside indigenous ceremonies, and decisions were made through consensus rather than patriarchal authority. Esperanza had emerged as the settlement's natural leader, her personal experience of slavery giving her a credibility with refugees that could not be earned through sympathy alone. She understood viscerally what it meant to be treated as property, to have one's humanity denied, and to face the terror of absolute powerlessness. This understanding allowed her to connect with traumatized arrivals in ways that others, however, well-intentioned, could not. "Father Martinez sent word from Santa Fe," Esperanza said, opening a letter that had arrived with the morning supply wagon. "He has 3 more families ready to make the journey, but they're being watched by slave hunters operating out of Albuquerque." The priest had become an unofficial coordinator for the underground network that funneled escapees toward their sanctuary. The challenge of protecting refugees during their journey to safety had proven to be one of the settlement's most complex problems. Unlike the Underground Railroad operating in the eastern states, which could rely on established routes and safe houses, the Western networks had to contend with vast distances, hostile terrain, and the ever-present threat of both official and unofficial pursuit. The system they had developed over months of trial and refinement represented a masterpiece of clandestine organization that drew on the strengths of all the cultures represented in their community. Apache knowledge of desert travel provided the foundation for safe passage across seemingly impassable terrain, while Mexican connections to church networks offered intelligence about safe contacts and dangerous areas. The few sympathetic Anglo settlers contributed legal knowledge and official documentation that could protect refugees from arbitrary arrest. Maria Sandoval, the settlement's newest arrival and most experienced organizer, spread a hand-drawn map across the kitchen table as she briefed Esperanza and Dasoda on the latest intelligence from their network of contacts. "The slave hunters have established checkpoints on all the main roads between Albuquerque and Santa Fe," she reported, pointing to marked locations. "They're stopping anyone who looks Mexican or Indian and demanding to see papers proving their free status." The legal fiction that allowed such harassment was complex and deliberately confusing, designed to give maximum latitude to those who profited from human trafficking. Territorial law theoretically prohibited slavery, but it also recognized labor contracts that could be bought and sold like property. Anyone unable to produce documentation proving their free status could be detained on suspicion of being an escaped laborer, then sold to cover the costs of their imprisonment. "We need to develop new routes," Dasoda said, studying the map, with the tactical eye that had served him well during his years as a scout. "The old trails are becoming too dangerous for families traveling with children and elderly members." His finger traced alternative paths through mountain passes and desert valleys that would require more time but offer greater security. Esperanza considered the options while bouncing Isabel on her knee, the domestic scene contrasting sharply with the military nature of their planning. What about using the mining roads, she suggested. The ore wagons travel those routes regularly, and their drivers are less likely to be questioned by authorities. The idea had merit, but it would require establishing relationships with sympathetic miners and teamsters. The solution they developed represented another innovation born from their unique circumstances. Rather than relying on a single route or method of transport, they created a flexible network that could adapt to changing conditions and threats. Sometimes refugees traveled hidden in legitimate cargo wagons. Other times they moved cross-country using traditional Apache methods of concealment and navigation. The key was maintaining multiple options and never becoming predictable in their operations. Their success in moving people safely to freedom had begun to attract attention from sympathetic sources throughout the territory. A Quaker merchant from Denver had begun secretly funding their operations, while a group of California abolitionists provided legal support for refugees who chose to continue westward. Even some territorial officials, disgusted by the corruption and cruelty of the slave trade, occasionally provided unofficial warnings about planned raids or investigations. But their growing reputation also brought increased scrutiny from those who profited from human trafficking. Territorial Governor Edmund Ross faced pressure from business interests who complained that the sanctuary was disrupting the labor supply and encouraging unrest among workers who might otherwise accept their conditions. The delicate political balance that had allowed their operations to continue was becoming increasingly unstable. "We received another offer to purchase the land," Esperanza said, showing Da Soda a letter from a mining consortium based in Denver. "They're offering 3 times what it's worth, with the clear implication that refusing might result in legal complications." The threat was subtle but unmistakable, representing the kind of economic pressure that had destroyed other sanctuary efforts. The decision facing the settlement's leadership was whether to maintain their current approach, which had proven effective but attracted unwanted attention, or to scale back their operations in hopes of avoiding confrontation with territorial authorities. It was a debate that reflected larger questions about the nature of resistance and the price of moral compromise in the face of overwhelming power. "If we accept their money and close our doors, how many people will die in chains who might have lived free?" Esperanza asked during one of the evening councils where such decisions were made. "How do we weigh our safety against the lives of those who have not yet found their way to us?" The question cut to the heart of every moral choice they had made since establishing the sanctuary. The answer came not from philosophical debate, but from direct experience. That very night, a family of 4 arrived at their gates, having walked for 6 days across hostile terrain to escape from a mining camp where they had been held as indentured servants. The father carried his youngest child, a boy of 3, whose legs had been broken by an overseer and had healed improperly without medical care. "We heard there was a place where people like us could be free," the mother whispered as Rosa Herrera cleaned her wounds and prepared food for the exhausted family. "We heard there was a Mexican woman who had been sold like we were, but who got away and now helps others get away too." The hope in her voice made clear that their sanctuary had become more than a physical location. It was a symbol of possibility for the hopeless. The settlement's response to this family crystallized their commitment to continuing their work regardless of the risks. The community's doctor, a former army surgeon who had joined them after being discharged for treating Apache patients, worked through the night to re-break and properly set the child's legs. The settlement's teachers began immediately planning how to help the older children overcome the educational gaps created by years of forced labor. Esperanza sat with the mother as dawn broke over the desert, listening to a story that had become heartbreakingly familiar. The family had been captured during a raid on their village in Sonora, transported north in chains, and sold to mine owners who worked them from dawn to dusk on starvation rations. The woman's husband had attempted escape, twice before, earning beatings that left him permanently weakened. "How did you find the courage to try again?" Esperanza asked, genuinely curious about the source of resilience that allowed people to keep fighting after experiencing such brutality. "What made you believe this time would be different?" The question reflected her own ongoing struggle to understand the nature of hope in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles. The woman's answer was simple but profound. "Because we heard about you. Because we learned that someone who had been where we were had found a way out and was helping others find it too." The power of example, Esperanza realized, might be their most important contribution to the struggle against slavery. This realization led to a new phase in the settlement's development, one that emphasized not just rescue and sanctuary, but active resistance to the entire system of human trafficking. Working with their network of contacts throughout the territory, they began gathering intelligence about slave operations, documenting the locations of camps and the identities of those involved in the trade. 2 years after the battle at Esperanza Springs, the settlement that bore Esperanza's name had become the foundation for a network of sanctuaries stretching from Texas to California. Each location was independent, but connected to the others through bonds of mutual support and shared purpose. The Underground Railroad of the West had found its organizational center and its inspiration. Esperanza sat in the same chair where she had once planned the settlement's defense. But now she held a different kind of document, a letter from the territorial legislature, officially recognizing the rights of free people of color to establish agricultural communities and operate businesses without interference. The political landscape was changing slowly but unmistakably in response to the moral pressure created by their example. Isabel, now a walking, talking toddler of 2.5, played in the garden where corn and beans grew in traditional Apache patterns alongside European vegetables and Mexican herbs. The child represented something new in the world, a person who had never known bondage, never experienced the fear of being owned, and would grow up taking freedom as her natural birthright. Dasoda had become more than a partner in the settlement's work. He had become family in the deepest sense, a choice that had surprised no one who had watched their relationship develop from mutual respect through shared danger to deep affection. Their marriage had been celebrated with ceremonies from both Apache and Mexican traditions, symbolizing the cultural fusion that characterized everything they had built together. "The governor wants to meet with us," Esperanza said, showing him the official invitation that had arrived with the morning mail. "He says he's interested in discussing our humanitarian work and its potential as a model for territorial policy." The language was diplomatic, but the underlying message was clear. Their activities had gained enough support to warrant official recognition. The prospect of working within the system rather than around it offered both opportunities and dangers. Official recognition would provide legal protection and access to resources that could dramatically expand their rescue operations, but it might also compromise their independence and limit their ability to act quickly when lives were at stake. "What does your heart tell you?" Dasoda asked, using the Apache phrase that meant trusting one's deepest wisdom rather than surface reasoning. "Not your mind, which can be confused by political calculations, but your heart, which knows what matters most." It was the question he asked whenever they faced difficult decisions. Esperanza looked out across the settlement, where dozens of formerly enslaved people were building new lives in freedom, where children played without fear, where different Cultures had found common ground in their commitment to human dignity. My heart tells me that we should never forget that our first duty is to those who are still in chains, she said finally. Politics and recognition are useful only if they serve that purpose. The decision they reached would shape not only their own future, but the broader struggle for human freedom throughout the American West. They would engage with territorial authorities, but on their own terms, maintaining their independence while working to change unjust laws and corrupt practices. The settlement would continue to serve as a sanctuary, but it would also become a center for advocacy and political organization. As the sun set on another day in the desert sanctuary, Esperanza walked through the settlement with Isabel on her shoulders, greeting the families that had found safety within its walls. Each face told a story of survival, of courage in the face of impossible odds, of the triumph of human spirit over institutional cruelty. The woman who had once knelt in chains while still bleeding from childbirth had become something her captors could never have imagined, a force for liberation that would echo across generations. Her daughter would grow up in a world where such freedom was possible because someone had been willing to pay any price to secure it. In the end, the greatest victory was not the defeat of individual enemies like Cortez, but the creation of something that could outlast any single person or generation. The sanctuary at Esperanza had become proof that ordinary people, given the chance, could build extraordinary communities based on justice, compassion, and mutual aid. And in a world where such proof was desperately needed, that legacy would endure long after its founders had returned to the desert dust from which all life springs and to which it inevitably returns. The spring of 1901 brought unprecedented change to the American Southwest as the new century ushered in technologies and social movements that would have seemed impossible during the violent days of Esperanza's captivity. Electric lights now illuminated the streets of major cities, railroads connected distant territories, and the territorial government had evolved into something approaching genuine representative democracy. But perhaps nowhere were these changes more evident than in the thriving community that had grown from the ashes of the old Valdez Ranch. Isabel Valdez Blackhorse stood on the platform of the newly constructed railway station, watching as another trainload of visitors arrived to study what newspapers across the nation had begun calling the Esperanza model. At 21, she had inherited her mother's fierce intelligence and her father's tactical mind, but she had also developed something uniquely her own, a gift for organizing people and resources that had transformed their small sanctuary into the administrative center of a network spanning 7 states. The young woman bore little physical resemblance to either of her parents, having inherited the best features of both Mexican and Apache heritage in a combination that seemed to embody the cultural fusion their community represented. Her dark hair was braided in traditional Apache style, but adorned with silver combs, crafted by Mexican artisans, while her clothing mixed practical frontier garments with formal elements appropriate to her role as an international spokesperson for refugee rights. Among the day's arrivals were a delegation of Quaker reformers from Philadelphia, a journalist from the New York Tribune, and representatives from the newly formed International Committee for the Abolition of Forced Labor. Each group had come to study the methods that had made their network so successful in combating human trafficking throughout the borderlands. Miss Blackhorse called Professor William Matthews from Harvard University, who was documenting successful examples of cross-cultural cooperation for his upcoming book on American social movements. Could you explain how your community has managed to maintain its effectiveness while expanding so rapidly? His question reflected the genuine puzzlement of academic observers who could not understand how such an unconventional organization continued to thrive. Isabel's response drew on years of experience, explaining their work to skeptical outsiders. "We never forgot that our purpose is to serve individual human beings rather than abstract principles," she said, leading the group toward the settlement's main meeting hall. "Every decision we make is tested against a simple question. Will this help someone escape slavery and build a free life?" The clarity of their mission had been their greatest strength during periods of rapid growth and change. The settlement that surrounded them bore witness to 2 decades of organic development, guided by practical necessity rather than theoretical planning. Adobe buildings in traditional Mexican style stood alongside Apache-inspired structures designed for desert conditions, while newer constructions incorporated the latest innovations in sanitation and electrical systems. Gardens and workshops reflected the same cultural diversity, producing everything from traditional crafts to modern agricultural implements. The population had grown from the original handful of refugees to nearly 300 permanent residents, with hundreds more passing through each year as they made their way to new lives throughout the West. But growth had not come at the expense of the intimate, family-like atmosphere that had characterized the early days. Newcomers were still welcomed with the same warmth and practical support that had greeted Esperanza during her darkest hour. As they toured the facilities, Isabel pointed out innovations that had been developed in response to specific challenges faced by their rescue operations. The medical clinic had evolved from a single room with basic supplies to a fully equipped facility staffed by doctors and nurses who specialized in treating the physical and psychological wounds left by slavery and abuse. The school had expanded from teaching basic literacy to offering advanced courses in law, medicine, and engineering. The success of the original sanctuary had inspired the creation of similar communities throughout the Southwest, each adapted to local conditions but connected through bonds of mutual support and shared purpose. What had begun as a single refuge had evolved into a coordinated network capable of moving people safely across thousands of miles of hostile territory. We currently operate 17 primary stations and 43 waypoints between Texas and California, Isabel explained to the visiting journalists as they examined a detailed map in the coordination center. Each location is independent and self-sustaining, but they communicate regularly and can provide emergency support when needed. The system had been designed to be resilient against both official interference and criminal retaliation. The railroad station that now served their community represented more than just improved transportation. It symbolized the mainstream acceptance their movement had gradually achieved. What had once been viewed as dangerous radicalism was now recognized as a legitimate humanitarian effort worthy of public support. The territorial government that had once threatened their operations now provided official escorts for refugee trains. But success had brought new challenges that required different strategies than those employed during the early years of desperate improvisation. The scale of their operations now required formal bureaucracy, professional fundraising, and political lobbying that sometimes conflicted with their original values of direct action and immediate response to human need. We've had to learn how to work within systems we once saw as enemies, Isabel admitted to Professor Matthews during a private interview. Government agencies, railroad companies, even some business interests now support our work, but that support comes with expectations and limitations that can be frustrating. The tension between institutional effectiveness and moral purity was an ongoing source of debate within their movement. The financial resources required to maintain their expanded operations had grown far beyond what could be provided by individual donations and volunteer labor. Corporate sponsors now contributed significant funding, but they also expected professional accounting and regular reports on how their money was being used. This transparency was generally positive, but it also meant that spontaneous rescues sometimes had to be delayed while proper documentation was prepared. Isabel had become skilled at navigating these complexities, but she sometimes missed the simpler days when decisions could be made quickly by a small group of people who knew and trusted each other completely. My mother tells stories about rescues that were planned and executed in a single afternoon, she said wistfully. Now we have committees and procedures for everything. The price of success was often the loss of the very qualities that had made success possible. The visiting delegation was particularly interested in the legal innovations that had emerged from their work. The territorial legislature had passed the Esperanza laws, a series of statutes that provided strong protections for refugees and severe penalties for those involved in human trafficking. These laws had become models for similar legislation in other states and territories. Legal victory is important, Isabel explained to the Quaker reformers, but it's not sufficient by itself. Laws only matter if they're enforced, and enforcement requires political will that can change with elections and economic conditions. Their movement had learned to build diverse coalitions that could maintain pressure for justice regardless of which party controlled the government. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows of the main house as Esperanza Valdez Black Horse sat in her study, reviewing correspondence from sanctuary operations throughout the network. At 38, she had evolved from a traumatized refugee to one of the most influential social reformers in the American West. But she had never lost the direct personal approach to human relationships that had characterized her earliest efforts. Her desk was covered with letters from people whose lives had been touched by their work. Former slaves who had become teachers and business owners, children who had grown up in freedom because their parents found sanctuary, and even some former slaveholders who had been moved to reconsider their practices after witnessing the humanity of those they had once considered property. One letter in particular had moved her to tears that morning. It came from a woman in California who had been rescued from a mining camp 15 years earlier and had just graduated from law school. "I want to dedicate my practice to continuing the work you began," the letter read. "Every legal victory for human rights will be a monument to the courage you showed in refusing to accept that some people are born to be owned by others." DeSoto entered the study carrying a cup of the herbal tea that had become their evening ritual, his hair now streaked with silver, but his bearing still straight and strong. Their partnership had weathered the stresses of public leadership while deepening into the kind of love that could only be forged through shared purpose and mutual respect. "The delegation from Washington wants to offer you apposition with the Bureau of Indian Affairs," he said, settling into the chair beside her desk. The offer represented recognition of Esperanza's expertise in cross-cultural cooperation and refugee assistance, but it also represented the kind of institutional co-optation that had destroyed other reform movements. "What do you think?" she asked, valuing his perspective on the political implications of such a move. "Would working within the federal government help our cause or compromise it?" DeSoto's response reflected years of experience navigating the complex relationship between indigenous peoples and the expanding American state. "The Bureau has always been more interested in controlling Indians than helping them," he said thoughtfully, "but perhaps having someone inside who understands both cultures could make a difference." The decision would require careful consideration of both opportunities and risks. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Isabel, who brought news that required immediate attention. "We've received word from Father Martinez in Santa Fe," she said, her expression grave. "There's been a raid on the sanctuary near Las Cruces. Federal marshals acting on complaints from mining companies have arrested 12 staff members and 37 refugees. The attack represented a significant escalation in official opposition to their work. The implications were immediately clear to all three of them. The mining companies had finally convinced federal authorities that the sanctuary network represented a threat to legitimate business interests that justified direct intervention. The careful political balance that had protected their operations for years was collapsing under pressure from powerful economic interests. "This is what we always knew would come," Esperanza said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the crisis. "The question is whether we're prepared to respond effectively." The network they had built was designed to be resilient, but it had never faced coordinated federal opposition, backed by corporate resources. The emergency meeting that followed brought together representatives from every major sanctuary in the network, connected by the telegraph system that had become their primary means of rapid communication. The discussion that followed revealed both the strengths and vulnerabilities of the movement they had created. The response to the federal crackdown demonstrated the maturity and sophistication the network had developed over 2 decades of operations. Rather than panicking or retaliating with violence, the sanctuary leaders implemented contingency plans that had been prepared for exactly this scenario. Legal challenges were filed immediately, political allies were mobilized to pressure Congress, and public opinion was rallied through carefully coordinated media campaigns. Within a week, newspaper editorials across the nation were condemning the raids as attacks on humanitarian work that posed no threat to legitimate business interests. Religious leaders of all denominations issued statements supporting the sanctuary network, while labor unions pointed out that the real threat to workers came from employers who used slave labor to undercut wages. The political coalition supporting refugee rights proved to be broader and more powerful than their opponents had anticipated, but the legal battle was only one front in a larger struggle that would determine whether the gains of the past 20 years could be preserved and extended. The mining companies and their political allies were well-funded and determined, viewing the sanctuary network as an existential threat to their ability to exploit vulnerable workers. They had resources for a prolonged campaign that could outlast the reformers' initial burst of public support. "We need to think beyond immediate crisis management," Isabel argued during one of the strategy sessions that now consumed most of their time. "This attack is happening because we've become successful enough to threaten powerful interests. That means we need to become even more powerful, not retreat into defensiveness." Her analysis reflected a new generation's understanding of political warfare. The solution that emerged from these discussions represented a fundamental evolution in their approach to social reform. Rather than limiting themselves to direct service and rescue operations, they would expand into political organizing, economic development, and educational initiatives designed to address the root causes of human trafficking. The sanctuary network would become the foundation for a broader movement for social justice. Esperanza found herself serving as the public face of this expanded mission, traveling throughout the country to speak at universities, churches, and political gatherings about the lessons learned from their work. Her personal story of transformation from slave to liberator resonated with audiences who might have dismissed abstract arguments about human rights. "Freedom is not a gift that can be given by one person to another," she told a gathering of social reformers in Chicago. "Freedom is a capacity that exists within every human being, waiting for the opportunity to flourish. Our job is not to free people, but to remove the barriers that prevent them from freeing themselves." The distinction was crucial to understanding both their past successes and future challenges. The epilogue to their story was still being written as the new century brought unprecedented opportunities for social change. The Industrial Revolution was creating new forms of wealth and power, but it was also generating new possibilities for organizing and resistance. The Sanctuary Network had become a model for other movements seeking to challenge entrenched systems of oppression. As the sun set over the desert landscape that had witnessed so much suffering and transformation, 3 generations of the Valdez Black Horse family gathered on the porch where so many crucial decisions had been made. Isabel's own daughter played at their feet, representing a 4th generation that would inherit the legacy of freedom they had fought to create. The woman who had once been sold in chains while still bleeding from childbirth had lived to see her daughter become a leader in the ongoing struggle for human dignity. The Apache warrior who had risked everything to purchase a stranger's freedom